Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining. We'll get started in a minute, just waiting for people to filter into the room. Okay, let's get started. All right. Welcome, folks. Thank you for joining me. I think we're going to have a really good conversation today, and it's going to cover a lot of different touch points around security. Right. There are some few hard truths that have ultimately surfaced, and they're going to dictate how we operate, going forward. Now, while the overall topic of discussion here is about how organizations can take a prescriptive approach to implementing security, right? We have to cover some basics, right? Some foundational and adjacent disciplines, because security is not going to exist in a vacuum. So we need a comprehensive understanding of some of the aspects of technology if we want to do security right. And also, every organization is different, right? It's different in terms of the industry it operates in. It's different in terms of the challenges it's trying to overcome, the resources that it has at its disposal. And I'm sure, I'm leaving out a variety of other factors as well. So a quick introduction on me, right? My name is Gurinder Bhatti. I'm a global security strategist for Okta. I lead the Okta pre-sales organization for security. And in my current role, I speak with customers and prospects on, all things security, right? Whether it's security within an Okta tenant, security of the Okta platform, or even general security practices like compliance, data security, identity management, or cloud security. I've spent about 2 decades primarily on the enterprise side, so doing what you guys do on a daily basis, but obviously focused on cybersecurity. So before we jump in, if you have or anytime if you have any questions, please feel free to put them to the in the presentation using the Q&A feature. Now, I am speaking out of from a hotel room, so in the interest of conserving some bandwidth, I will go off camera just so that the presentation can stay clear. Here's a, let me see if I can stop video. There you are. So here's a broad agenda of what we're going to talk about, right? We'll start with the shifts in industry, and I specifically mean that in a plural sense, right? It's a multifaceted momentum that is driving a lot of the efforts that organizations are undertaking, right? We'll talk about the constant threats that we as security practitioners and security officers need to tackle. I don't have to qualify too much to you guys when it comes to talking about how important security is, right? But I think it's worth the conversation to get some basic stuff down pat. Zero trust. We'll talk about zero trust. Obviously, you hear it everywhere. And it's important. I think it really is. But more than just the buzzword, and more than me going through all the things that you should, do to get to like a zero trust state, I think my aim here is for you to have a fundamental understanding of the core methodology and the baseline components necessary for its success and how to begin that journey, right? And finally, what are some tangible steps that you can take for securing your organization? So today's session is meant to provide you with a prescriptive and actionable approach that you can take to realize some of the immediate gains in your organization's security posture. So let's start with this fundamental truth, right? You are a technology company. You can produce widgets, you can sell timeshares, you can, be some kind of consultant firm that helps their clients get out of, credit card debt. Irregardless, your organization is a technology company and you have to treat it as such. What does that really mean? It means that technology is not just a tool that assists in executing on your core business, but it's a critical component of your business that if it's not properly implemented and maintained, it's going to bring your business to a halt. And second, let's talk about remote work, right? About hybrid workforce. And it's certainly a very big shift, but we can't keep calling it the new normal. I think, probably late 2020, sometime in 2021, it became the new normal, right? Organizations understood it, whether it was because that was the only way that they could stay afloat to operate the business, whether it was because, employees demonstrated their resolve in functioning productively, while being remote or hybrid. It could also have been because organizations realized some sort of cost savings. So think about, less real office real estate, less employee lunches or travel. Or maybe it was simply because the talent that you need to run your business is not living down the block or, in a 15-minute commute from your office. But to me, this is no longer the new normal. It's just a normal. And it may be some semantics here, but I interpret normal as an operating pattern that has existed for some time, right? And while a new normal is sort of a drastic shift in that we've been exposed to all of a sudden, that the fact that this operating pattern has been in place for almost 2 years, it really warrants that, we look at it as it's just how it is and how it'll continue to be moving forward. So we need to put in concrete solutions because, again, this is just how it will be and this is the normal. So that's one of the trends that we're looking at, right? Another one is cloud adoption. Huge, right? If you pay attention to things like earnings calls and revenue forecasts from, the big three, AWS, Microsoft, and Google, it's astonishing. Because of how big these numbers are. I mean, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars, but B, because there's really not much slowing down, right? The big three are forecasting growth in their cloud businesses. And, some of that might be because cloud services are getting costlier, but I bet you majority of it is because more and more organizations are adopting cloud and existing ones are using cloud computing more. I mean, you don't have to look further than what we do at Okta, right? Here at Okta, our customer account continues to increase, and those customers are continuing to expand their usage of our cloud services. So what's driving cloud adoption? If you kind of like sit back and think about it, it's ultimately the bottom line, right? The business benefits by moving to the cloud, and it does so because there are some defining characteristics that cloud offers, which traditional data centers just don't, right? So if you think about things like metered service, only paying for what you use, it's a huge cost savings. The ability to rapidly spin up or spin down your infrastructure as needed. Broad network access. We talked about, hybrid workforce. So giving your employees that same user experience, that same security, regardless of whether they're in the office, whether they're in a different country or a continent. On-demand self-service, right? Again, a huge cost savings because you don't have to buy hardware ahead of time. You can literally spin up compute as needed or network resource or storage resources. And finally, resource pooling, right? Resource pooling allows cloud service providers to bundle a lot of their capabilities to offer multiple customers so they can realize savings on their end as well. So I kind of, went through all these, I guess, wonderful, progressive trends and capabilities. And it does sound like a win if you think about it, right? We want our employees to work from anywhere. We want to pay only for the resources we use. We want to integrate technology into as many processes as in our organization as possible to drive things like automation. Now, all these things sound wonderful, and they definitely are, but with them, they bring their own unique set of challenges and risks. So that's important to address as well, right? Threats, right? Basically, as I like to think of it, stuff that keeps us employed. And what this means is that no matter how sophisticated, defenses become, they will always trail the capabilities of threat actors. And it's par for the course. And rightly so. I mean, a lot of the capabilities, if you think about, from a capability and technology perspective that the security industry, comes up with, it's in direct response to threats that are plaguing all of our organizations. Now, I talk about every, company being a technology company, and I talk about what makes the cloud so desirable, but all that is to set the stage for what we're really here to discuss, which is security, right? We're going to primarily focus on security in the cloud as an organization, and as an organization, like, what are some of the fundamental building blocks and best practices? But threats exist regardless of on-prem or cloud, right? Regardless of public or private sector, and regardless of large or small companies, even in different geos. And just as, technology has evolved, many threats are just sophisticated, evolved versions of their predecessors. If you take it, for example, phishing, right? Phishing evolved into targeted severe phishing, and smishing, which is, when it's carried out over text. Malware evolved from just infecting your systems to now locking your data and demanding funds for decryption keys. That's what ransomware is. And their unique properties come from the fact that they take advantage of modern technologies to carry out. For example, if you think about distributed denial of service, right, DDoS, we're all aware of that. That's where an attacker overwhelms the victim machines by sending it massive amounts of requests, and it simply kind of cannot throttle that. It chokes the compute, and the victim machine cannot process legitimate requests. Well, with the cloud, the ability to spin up massive farm of attack machines and point them to a victim server is pretty easy. It's expensive, but still it's doable, right? So as your company expands its services and offerings, right, the attack service also changes. And with the cloud adoption, you may be, housing your applications in the cloud, which means your data is no longer in your hands. And there are challenges that this fact introduces as far as ensuring it's properly protected, users no longer in your environment or in your controlled network, right? There also may be, devices that you don't have control over. All these different surfaces require protection in different ways. Or let's talk about personas, right, that are on your network and handling your data. Before, it was usually your corporate employees, but now you have partners, you have suppliers, you have consumers, consultants, even temp workers. So this vertical of what and who is touching your data is constantly changing, and it's mostly expanding. So that contributes to that attack surface, right? Now, data has always been that North Star for threat actors. At the end of the day, that's what threat actors are after. It's always going to be your data. And clever and unique ways of attacks are utilized to perform everything from account takeovers to man-in-the-middle attacks to malicious payloads by these bad actors, right? Now, what we've been going over here is that digital transformation and cloud adoption, they open up new attack vectors and new domains that require different methods of protection. But just to, kind of show you guys some more numbers here, right? Let's talk about some of the scary stuff, the breaches, the company name on the front page, but not in a good way, the loss of revenue as a result, right? All these are real and impacting drivers. If you skim through the latest Verizon data breach investigations report, right, and you'll see credential theft, it takes this top spot once again. So as much as we like to think, talk about things like passwordless and removing passwords, the reality is that most organizations are simply not mature enough to adopt, something like passwordless credentials. So we need to protect our users and their passwords, and credentials are a big attack vector. And while breaches and compromises are these headlining grabbing events, I think the real cost comes in the aftermath, right? Which involves everything from investigations to public relations, to containment and remediation. I mean, $4.35 million on average, that's a lot of money, right? So as you can see, right, the first order cost due to breaches or the subsequent cost of the aftermath of a breach and its fallout, they're both insane amount of money compared to the alternative of actually investing in security, right? Be it through people, be it through processes or technologies. And one of the trends that we're seeing is organizations are starting to prioritize security efforts and security projects more and more. So let's pivot a little bit to talk about actually, proactive security measures, right? At a high level, we're going to compartmentalize the different initiatives to tackle when implementing mitigating security practices. And we'll certainly dig into each of these, starting with user enablement, right? Or security enablement, right? The how and why of equipping users in the right way. We'll also talk about hardening systems, right? It's a very critical and important undertaking, and we'll see how to do that. And next, we'll talk about selectively filtering traffic to the extent that you can, right? I think you'll be surprised if you perform this exercise on how much volume you can reduce by doing this, and in turn, not only or only be left to deal with a subset of that entire, traffic set or that threat set. Mobile security, right? Again, with cloud adoption, the way organizations operate post 2020, it really requires a different set of policies and practices. And finally, piggybacking on this last point, expanding that protect surface to implement additional controls. So starting with user security, right? The old adage about security starts with people and then processes and then technology is absolutely true, right? We'll cover some of this later on as well, but the concept of this identity-centric security has been talked a lot about lately in the industry. And if you think about the role an identity plays, it's crucial to protecting access to resources. Because at the end of the day, nothing happens until an identity requests access to a resource or acts on a resource. For example, if you have data sitting in a database and it never gets touched, it's not pulled, it's not written to, not even viewed, it's pretty safe, but you're also on no man's land, right? And that data is essentially useless. One other point I'll add here about identity is that it's not just users, right? Your identity is your users, it's your APIs, your service accounts, and anything that needs to act on data. So do keep that in mind. Now, we all know the merits of user training, right? Year after year, credential theft and identity compromises lead to data breaches. You saw that in some of the statistics I showed you. So running campaigns that align to what modern threats are happening is a good way to keep your users sharp. Not saying that every user will never click on a phishing link, but you can shrink that number down. Next is understanding and baseline your user behavior patterns. So, as a small to medium business, right, you probably have a good idea of where your users reside and the functions they perform on a day-to-day basis when it comes to your most sensitive assets. So building baseline policies off of that knowledge can help you identify anomalies as well as deviations from known patterns, right? Which could be a cause for alerting your SOC, raising an event in your ticketing system, or any kind of ticket that needs to be investigated. And finally, all users will not be perfect all the time, right? I think we as sometimes security people lose sight of that fact because we're usually pretty cognizant of a lot of these threats. But from an end user perspective, who is head down in their day-to-day job, a lot of times they're not necessarily going to practice the best user behavior, right? Sometimes they will unknowingly click on a link, or maybe they'll create a guessable password, or maybe they'll leave their screen unlocked. And this is where the technology comes into play, right? So relying on your security technologies to layer on defenses, to provide additional controls that augment your security behavior in case a behavioral control is bypassed and you need to exercise a technical one. MFA is a great example of this, right? If a user is, let's say, has a guessable password, or somebody's able to, phish their password, but they still need to go through sort of like a phishing resistant multi-factor authentication, you're able to thwart the threat actor in their path and kind of minimize some of the impact they can have on your organization. Because remember, the goal of security here is not to be perfect, but to be good enough with an eye towards continuous improvement. So next is system hardening and patching, right? Important and absolutely critical for organizations. There are three things that you're aiming to achieve here by having this proper system hardening guidelines and processes in place. First, you want to make sure that your system or the system that you connect to on your network allow you to connect to. So first, you want to make sure that the systems that you connect to on your network are, can't be compromised by settings that you don't require for that system to have, right? So for example, if a server is being spun up and it's a web server, but the image gets thrown on there has SQL running, you should ask yourselves why, right? You should audit that baseline config, right? If specific services and ports are not needed, turn them off. Secondly, you don't want to leave default credentials of any system on there, regardless of where they sit in your network, right? Change your default credentials, and you'll be surprised how often a box gets popped because default creds or easily guessable credentials were present on there. And finally, with constant vulnerabilities being announced, right, having a proper patch management process in place is really important, especially for organizations that are heavily in the cloud. We talked about some of the characteristics of cloud in terms of rapid elasticity. So with compute instances being spun up and down constantly, you want to make sure that whatever image your developers or admins are using to install on a newly created server, it has the latest patches, right? And there are some other controls I think you should also look at in terms of locking down USB ports or proper endpoint agents on your systems as well. Filtering traffic. When I say filter traffic, I think most people think about north and southbound traffic. And it's certainly important. And most organizations do that because there's usually a firewall, a proxy, or a gateway of some sort in place that's going to broker that connection. But also important is to take that next step and filter your east-west traffic, right? And we traditionally call that network segmentation. And for example, if you have, let's say, a guest wireless network, ask yourselves if you should talk to your regular user network, and what is the reason for that, right? Or for example, your DMZ should only be able to talk to your internal network on certain ports and certain segments. Another benefit of filtering that lateral movement or east-west traffic is that it reduces the impact surface. So if, for example, you have a virtual LAN that a threat actor is able to get on and compromise a system on, but that VLAN is blocked from the rest of your network, it reduces that lateral movement that this person can do, right? So again, reducing that attack surface and being able to quarantine that impact. Media device security is important, right? As I mentioned in the onset, hybrid workforce is here to stay, right? It's abundantly becoming the majority of how employees operate between their professional and personal lives. So it means that the location they work from, the devices they use to work, and the applications they access, all of this can and does change from time to time. So absolutely crucial that you as an organization understand that it's your responsibility to secure your assets on the user devices, right? It's not the user's fault, for example, if they download a game on their iPhone or some kind of application that ends up stealing your company email, right? It's your responsibility and ultimately your decision to, let's say, not have proper security controls in place as far as things like device health, device posture checks, or an MDM solution, requirements for PIN or MFA, right? All these things are responsibilities of your organization, regardless of what the device the user is using. Because keep in mind, right, as an end user, you always try to opt for the most convenience and the most frictionless user experience. And if security gets in the way of that, you're going to try to go around it, whether it's using different devices, whether it's using third-party applications that are not sanctioned. So again, it's on us as security professionals to make sure that our policies are properly there to protect company resources and company assets. Now, this expansion of controls, right? It's not only applicable to cloud migrations or systems in the cloud. I think, on-premise challenges around suppliers, vendors, and partners also exist, right? You want to be able to have, these security policies that mirror your risk tolerance, right, and your risk appetite. Also, keep in mind, when you go through things like cloud migration or moving your workloads to the cloud or adopting cloud, the things that you enforce on-prem, they don't traditionally map one-to-one to the cloud. And I talked about that earlier in terms of, for example, your data, right? When you have a data center, when you have a database or something, you can literally walk up to that and say, hey, this is where my PII lives, and I'm going to access it. I'm going to, do XYZ to it. But good luck trying to do that in a cloud environment where the cloud service provider has given you a resource in the form of, perhaps a blob storage or an S3 bucket, but you have no idea where that sits. You have no idea what kind of controls outside of what your logical controls are, right? So you're not going to be able to put the same kind of policies that you had on premise into your cloud environment. So that's important to understand. Third-party risk management, again, very important here. If you guys, have been looking at some of the news past few years, whether it's Colonial Pipeline or SolarWinds, right? Third-party risk is absolutely critical. It's so crucial because often we talk about sort of making sure our environment is clean, making sure our environment is secure, but with this new way of operating where you're always consuming other people's applications or resources, you're doing business with suppliers and vendors across the globe, third-party risk management is crucial for us to have a confidence that the other party is going to be able to comply with our risk posture. So that's important as well. And obviously, we talked about hybrid workforce, in terms of expanding that footprint of operation, right? Whether it's through new devices, whether it's new location users are operating out of, or more often than not, it's usually consuming resources and applications that are no longer in your control, right? So you can see how this expansion of controls is starting to proliferate and present those challenges that we talked about. I mentioned this earlier, but I want to shift the focus back to this concept of identity-centric security. When you step back and think about your organization, again, regardless of size or vertical or geo, right? As your business operates, and since we established that every company is a technology company in the beginning, the aim of the company functioning as it's supposed to results in data moving from one place to another, right? That's all there is, right? Data is being created. It gets stored, used, shared, archived, deleted, and those are the 6 stages of data. But when you have a user or even a system account, think of all the states that account traverses on its way to performing one of those data lifecycle activities, right? It could be authenticating to a computer, could be routing over the network by logging in via VPN, accessing a web server, interacting with an application. So, as you see here, regardless of what component is processing the request, the identity remains critical and consistent. So identity is that singular entity which you can anchor your security strategy around, right? So again, that identity-centric security that I talked about, because it's the only thing that's going to remain static. Again, your device may change because I might be using my laptop today and then my wife's laptop tomorrow, or I might be working out of the office or home and another day I'm at a coffee shop. So, devices, location, IP, or even the application or resources that I'm accessing, they all change, right? But identity doesn't. So again, this concept of identity-centric security is important because we see the long-term strategy of that implementation, right? We see organizations understanding that security needs to move away from sort of network-centric boundaries to focus more on the user. And security is paramount here because by correlating that identity across different states, whether again, it's the network, the application, or devices, you can build proper policies that will protect your assets right up to the actual resource, because identity can be tied up all the way to the data that it's going to act on. So this kind of, pivots nicely into this concept of zero trust, right? And this is where zero trust comes in. One thing you probably heard every vendor talk about, or at least they should talk about, is that zero trust is not a singular product, right? It's not a single solution, it's not a single product, and it's not a silver bullet to get rid of all the security challenges that we talked about. So if it's not that, what is it, right? We talk about being a mindset and a methodology. It's a mindset that's rooted in these core zero trust principles of least privilege, no implicit trust, and continuous monitoring, right? So just to cover that, least privilege is when you're only allowing the bare minimum access required to do a job and nothing more. No implicit trust means that you're not granting access and authorizations by virtue of some other property, right? So for example, just because I'm on the network doesn't mean I should have access to every resource that's available. And finally, continuous monitoring, right? Continuous monitoring it's not just about, bringing in data and collecting logs, right? Continuous monitoring is about continuously looking at the state of your resources and making sure that there isn't a deviation from what should be typically happening, right? We talked about earlier in the presentation on, deriving sort of a user baseline. Well, this is sort of a normal operating baseline you want to derive in this context, and you want to continuously monitor any deviations from that baseline. So this diagram, which is codified by CISA, is the Zero Trust Maturity Model. And if anyone notices something interesting, it should be that identity is the first pillar. And that's, again, crucial to understand, right? It starts with identifying who is requesting access to whatever it is that they're trying to protect, right? Whether it's over the network, whether it's via a BYOD, whether it's on-prem or cloud, they all require authentication, which in turn needs identity, right? So I want to spend a couple of minutes here before moving on. When we at Okta, obviously, talk to customers about zero trust, we talk about implementing, this least privilege, need to know security policies. And since there is no perimeter, right, you have to never trust and always verify. And, one of the things that I like to call out is, regardless of what the customer is doing to implement zero trust, it's always coming back to identity, right? If a customer or if a organization is talking about, let's say, getting rid of their VPN because many of their resources are in the cloud. So the focus here is the network pillar, as you've seen, right? And that's great, right? That should be the focus if you're trying to sunset your VPN infrastructure, is assessing your network architecture. But how are you ensuring that your employees are who they say they are when they try to log into maybe a web gateway that's going to route your corporate traffic to your cloud systems, right? If you're focusing on putting on, let's say, an MDM on your devices, that's also great. And I think you should do that. But how can you be confident that the person using that device that you spent so many resources securing is who they say they are? So as you see, right, identity is absolutely critical to going down the zero trust path, right? Regardless of what other vertical you're implementing or you're looking at or assessing, authentication and identity is going to be crucial to every one of those other layers. So what we're finding with our customers and what they're thinking about is with their identity and access management is maturity, right? In a way that this model here you can see depicts to start a lot of their zero trust initiatives. I want to throw up a poll to ask you guys. I want to go through the slide and ask about what stage is your organization in when it comes to identity maturity. So starting with a fragmented identity in stage 0, where it's quite difficult to enforce things like contextual access policies, and you may have Active Directory on premise and perhaps other user stores. So there's fragmentation there, right? You can see this is a very nascent and immature identity implementation. And as the program matures, we start to unify that identity into stage 1 and set the groundwork for doing things like contextual access in a zero trust way. And this is things around deploying single sign-on across employees, even your partners in supply chain, using modern multi-factor authentication, and then unifying those policies and across applications and servers under a single identity access management platform. From there, you're moving in to something like stage 2, where you start to use context-based access policies, like understanding whether the device is trusted or not, right? You're using multiple factors across user groups. So for example, hard tokens for your developers that access your critical applications, and maybe sort of a push notification or push verification for your regular users, or biometrics for your highly sensitive applications. And you're doing things like automated deprovisioning for people's leaving the organization, or contractors whose contract is up and no longer work with the organization, because you don't want them to have access to resources once they're no longer working with you. And you also are providing security for your APIs. So this is what stage 2 looks like. And as you gradually progress towards sort of an adaptive workforce in stage 3, you're no longer just relying on context-based, but now you're looking at risk, right? You're looking at risk-based policies. You're doing things around continuous and adaptive authentication and authorization that I talked about from a zero trust perspective. You're looking at implementing passwordless authentication, because again, you want to get rid of any kind of friction for your users while you're providing that security, right? So I think from some of the surveys that we've done, and we've looked at, across the 700 organizations, they're typically engaging in stage 3 activities around zero trust, right? In whether they're currently engaged in a zero trust initiative or they're going to be in the next 12 months or so. So that's an encouraging sign. I think it's important to understand that organizations are relying on identity to be that next security pillar for their overall strategy. So to wrap up, right, because I want to leave some time for questions as well. We talked about proactive security measures, right? User security, mobile, system hardening, traffic filtering, and so on. And there are best practices and recommendations I think we try to provide. But specifically with small and medium businesses, it certainly can be daunting, right? SMBs aren't always blessed with unlimited budgets and an army of resources. So tackling those initiatives can be challenging because, I'm fully aware that we as a security, let's say, line of business or department or team, we're always looked at as a cost center, right? But we need to provide value. And one of the ways that we do so is by showing quick wins in terms of security uplifts and user experience, right? Users are happy when they encounter the least friction and they're allowed to be productive, but that freedom doesn't need to come at the expense of being insecure. In fact, the premise behind security should be that it just sits in the background doing what it's intended to do and enforcing security controls. Keep in mind, security, if you implement security correctly, it's absolutely going to help your business, right? It's often when we're introducing things like friction and a bad user experience that hinders a user productivity that, security gets a bad name. But again, if done right, it absolutely will help, right? So let's start with the what. Um, let's start with, identifying, right, your protect surface. You can't protect what you don't know. The simple approach here is that, that often gets often overlooked is making sure that you can classify and understand what you have in your environment. And from there, you assign classifications, right? Okay, these are sensitive assets. These are, highly regulated, server farms that we need to protect, and so on and so forth. So classification after identification is crucial. And then from there, you implement policies, right? Because you want to design policies around that classification and that risk appetite, and then be able to implement them from an enforcement perspective. So that's the what, right? Now let's talk about sort of the how. Right? Bringing it back to sort of the security measures, right? Mapping them to that CISA zero trust security model. Everything that we talked about begins with identity. Person, entity, service, device, they can all be identified, right? And we can simplify management of these identities and policies by pulling them into a single administrative interface. So think about that identity maturity curve that I talked about. Gradually leveraging that to implement certain capabilities and functionality and controls. That's going to help you mature into sort of a zero trust posture and a zero trust architecture. So with that, I certainly want to thank you guys for joining us. I hope you guys learned a couple of things, and we certainly like to put a lot of effort into these lunch and learns. We'd appreciate it if you can, look at a survey that's going to be popping up on your screen to help us understand how we can make these better going forward. I'm going to go ahead and look at the chat and Q&A and see if there's any questions that I can answer real time. Through the Okta app, can we use biometrics instead of a code? Yeah, absolutely. Okta, the Okta Verify application allows for biometric authentication. If you allow BYOD, how do you ensure that systems used can be patched? Can you enforce auto update on old phones, computers, etc.? You can enforce some things, right? You can enforce things like minimum OS version. You can enforce things like device pin lock, and certain things around no jailbroken applications or no jailbroken BYOD devices. So there's certain things you can do to bring that attack surface down and smaller from a device perspective. What do you recommend if there are no company phones? Employees own their own phones, so I don't have. Yeah, exactly. So an identity platform like Okta, it certainly has the ability to enroll BYOD devices into the platform to have a registration around it, and with that registration comes the ability to do device posture checks. Right, so look for the ability to say, hey, I'm not going to give you a phone, but if you're leveraging company resources, if you have company applications on this phone, there's a certain expectation that I have the ability to scrutinize the health of that phone in order to protect those company resources. Will Okta support platform single sign-on on Windows and Mac platforms? Yeah, that's a roadmap item. I think we're going to be rolling something out initially next year. We're starting with desktop MFA, and then we're gradually going to be providing single sign-on as well directly to Okta through your desktop login as well. Is there any webinars that would allow us to see ZTA being implemented at action? That's a really good question. I think often, I come across customers and prospects who talk about, well, what about practically implementing Zero Trust? I think we're going to be doing that, launching that next year. We want to go and do some prescriptive approach to implementing Zero Trust and some of the strategies around that. And they go into leveraging the principles of least privilege, no implicit trust, and continuous monitoring. But again, how do you do that, right? So we're certainly going to be building some of those collateral out, so do look out for that. will single sign-on for Mac include file vault encrypted devices? That's a good question. I think that's a little bit on the roadmap in terms of what the features will be, but surely, we're going to be iterating over that capability as time, progresses. So if there's no limitations from, let's say, the Apple side or our ability to look at encrypted devices, we certainly will look to implement that because we want to be able to protect those resources at the end. Can Okta or will Okta do MDM, remote wipe, etc.? So no, because Okta is not a MDM provider. What we want to do at that point is be able to provide your Okta admins or you as an Okta customer the ability to scrutinize the health and posture of that device, right? A full-fledged MDM is what you would need in order to do something like a remote wipe. But in order to check health of that device, that's something we can certainly do today in by way of device enrollment. How does this interact with standard user privileges? How can we reduce admin accounts on all endpoints? That's a good question. Right now, again, you have to understand where Okta currently lives, right? And Okta lives as that identity provider to your resources. So having admin accounts on endpoints is not something that we would have the ability to enforce. If that changes in the future because we have more of a hook into the operating system, that's certainly we would look into. But currently, we won't be able to do anything around admin accounts on endpoints. But having said that, again, our integrations with things like EDRs to understand and assess the risk and security of that end device does come in handy, right? So, for example, making sure Windows Firewall and AV are running, or if you have something like CrowdStrike, what is the CrowdStrike risk score on that endpoint? Those are things we can look at now and be able to determine access policies based off of that. All right. I think that was it. So I just want to thank everybody again for their time. I think this was really good, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.